Hello and welcome to another lesson. We have another exciting lesson for you. You can launch your 3ds Max this time and totally join us. We will execute a daytime scenario from start finish with full control over every aspect of the process. Just to remind you, in the last practical lesson, we learned how to use Corona Sun and Sky. We divided our scene into 3 different layers and started to think about them separately. We started with the midground, jumped into the background, and left the foreground for last. We solved problems one by one and reached a pretty interesting and realistic depth. Whereas in our last theoretical lesson, we analyzed our images in black and white and went through many possible traps we can fall into. As for today, we will add another piece to those puzzles. We are bringing in a new concept, a new tool to manage daytime scenarios. We are talking about sun direction. How to choose it, how does it affect the subject of our rendering and the entire scene, all of that ahead of us. We will also jump into the Photoshop and try to do a simple color correction. We will make all of those from start to finish, the way we do it in a commercial project. As usual, we will briefly introduce the theory before diving into the practical part. Okay, let's dive into the subject of the sun's direction and position first. Let's ask ourselves, what does the client really want when he or she commissions us to execute a daytime scenario? You can say that they want us to show their building in the best light, right? No pun intended. They want to see how the architecture would really look like at this time of the day. They want to see how it is being used. Because, empty night shots might be a preference for us artists, but most of the clients want to sell, which is a daytime use of space. At night, people sleep. They want to induce positive emotions, happy white clouds and a blue sky and all of that fun stuff, That's what sells the most, and we can surely execute it with full grace. Lighting direction plays a huge role in the perception of our clients' projects. We want to use it to help viewers understand the architecture. If we choose a bad direction, we can easily end up with our scenes being flat, overexposed, unreadable, or simply unattractive. Lighting direction can determine what our visualization is really about. Whether this is a building, maybe a part of it, or a space in front of it. Let's take a look. We have the same frame here and 2 more or less daytime scenarios. Both images are pretty successful. We have a proper depth and tonal ranges. We don't lose details in white and black. Nevertheless, one of those images is about the building and the other one is about the courtyard, right? Choosing a proper light direction might be crucial to show what we intend to show and meet our client's expectations. Now, getting to the point, we'll talk about the pros and cons of different light directions. Firstly, we'll take a look at how it affects our architecture. We'll briefly break down this matter down, and you'll quickly notice there's just a handful of options. Some of them more and some of them less optimal. Later, we'll dive deeper into the analysis and see how the sun's direction affects the rest of the scene, how it affects the materials, the general feeling, and how we can control it and make it all well considered. Let's start then. And basically, we have 4 distinct light directions: backlight, front light, and 2 side lights, left and right. The backlight makes the architecture fully shaded. Front light makes it fully lit. Side lights make one of the facade lit and keep the other in shade. So let's go through them one by one. We'll start with something less optimal: the backlight and the front light. The backlight itself will be generally the worst in daytime scenario. We cannot see where the corner of the building is. Everything appears to be flat and it's hard to tell the difference between the right and the left facade. This direction doesn't come near to what the architects had in mind, thinking about a day scenario. Most often, it's going to be hard to read the form, to read the details, so we definitely don't recommend it. though this direction can bear a significant amount of emotion, and we will certainly explore it in other lighting scenarios such as sunset. The front light will be a slightly better choice. We can definitely distinguish these second level details, and it helps us to understand the massing of this building. Nevertheless, we still cannot really tell that we have a corner here. The wall on the left is still similarly bright to the wall on the right. The material seems pretty identical. This is why this option also won't be our optimal solution. Picking, we get the best results when we present one of the walls in the sunlight and keep the other one in the shade. It is when we use either left side or right side lighting. This is the way for us to understand the very basic character of the architectural massing. We can see that this corner is finally well distinguishable, something that we haven't got from the previous light directions. We are able to see how one facade behaves when fully lit and the other one in full shadow. This gives us additional information about the stone cladding, wood paneling and plaster. We can understand their colors and reflectivity on a slightly deeper level. It's not flat and one-dimensional anymore. It seems we have one winner here, but I must admit that this way of dividing lighting into 4 categories is a bit simplified. Still, it gives you that initial feeling of our visualization requires to look good. We will dive a bit deeper into it though, and try to look at the matter from the perspective of an entire scene. It turns out that there is another way we can understand our lighting direction in relation to the building's position. We can draw a simple top view diagram. Here's our building, and here's our camera. Those 2 sectors on the left and right indicate the angles from which we get sunlight on only one facade. As we can see, it's not a binary situation of side lighting being on or off. It can happen along the entire spectrum, from here to there. We can additionally divide them with a line to show that one part of it is more frontal and another part is more from the back. In addition to it, we can add that maybe area in front. These are the angles from which the sunlight both facades, but not in a uniform way. This can be attractive for us in some cases, so we don't want to deny it entirely. Nevertheless, let's bring our attention back to our side segments. The thing with them is that our side lighting from this angle will be totally different from the side lighting positioned here. These differences may be crucial for our perception of the image. We will explore it thoroughly right now. Both ends of the spectrum will differ drastically, and while we move our sun position from one end to another, we also smoothly shift between 2 very specific looks. The material, sky, aerial perspective, all these aspects change. We can see it clearly in these 2 examples. On the top image, we have sunlight from one end, the more frontal part, and in the bottom one, we have the opposite side of the spectrum. We pointed out a few important differences regarding the look of greenery, the sky, reflective objects, micro-contrast, and volumetric behavior. We will talk about them one by one, and it will become a solid tool for you to set the proper direction and evaluate whether the scene behaves properly. Firstly, we have a very distinctive difference in how all our vegetation shaders look. All plant shaders consist of 2 base colors, diffuse and translucency. Diffuse plays a bigger role when the sun shines from the front, while translucency does it when the sun shines from the back. We will talk about them much more in the next lesson, entirely dedicated to vegetation shaders. As for now, we can notice that the greenery appears to be way more energetic and fresh when lit from the back, while it's drier, darker, and more desaturated when we lit from the front. Both of these options are realistic, but we often aim from this greater-than-life experience for our clients, and this is why we often rather tend to go with the backlight appearance. Secondly, we have a visible difference between the brightness of the sky and the other objects in the scene. The sky will be relatively closer to the sun itself when we lit from the back. It will make it pretty bright, very often really the brightest part of our composition. On the other hand, when we have more frontal light, oftentimes the directly lit building will be the brightest part of the image, which can be very useful when you think about proper hierarchy in your composition. You can clearly see how the color of the sky changes in the relationship to the other objects. There is also a difference in how other materials in the scene behave, especially water. Front light let us see directly through the water. We can see the bottom, and the watercolor plays a bigger role here. Whereas when we move the sun to the back, the reflection on the water's surface became more and more important. We have a brighter sky being reflected. We see a silhouette of the building, and the perception of the bottom is way weaker. I think it is even more apparent in the scene which we have mentioned at the beginning of this lesson. Take a look at the foreground. In the first example, these paving stones read more directly. The diffuse aspect is more important. In the second example, we can see that the glossiness comes to play. The bright sky is reflected, and the materials gain sort of another layer of depth. So we have kind of a diffuse versus reflect battle whenever we choose to go with either front or backlight situation. And basically, the materials will tend to look flat in the frontal light, while the backlight brings a lot of micro contrast to the table. We can see it here, and we can also notice it in the example where we had this white gravel. It is definitely way flatter here. The difference will be also noticeable in how volumetric materials are perceived. We will talk about them later in this training, but as for now, we can just check this aerial perspective produced by the corona volume effect. The backlight makes the sky brighter and the mountains darker, which results in the depth feeling more profound. I want to point out that we didn't change any volume effects between those two examples here. It's only the behavior of the sign direction. This is why we can think about setting the volume effect higher when lighting our scene frontally. This way we can compensate for the effect we lose when choosing the sun direction. We can sum up this part by saying that frontal and backlight have totally different characteristics, and what we named earlier as side lighting will be set somewhere in the spectrum between these two extrema. The differences will be numerous, and we don't need to always think about all of them. It is only important to be aware, even intuitively or subconsciously, of what we are exactly balancing here. What are those impressions? What are those distinctive looks? It can work on different levels in various scenes. It can be blatantly obvious if we have a bunch of greenery there or a lot of reflective objects. If we move our sun backwards, we start to play with translucency, reflection, microcontrast, and layers. If we move it forward, we emphasize the natural, direct colors and overall blocking of our composition. Let's keep that in mind when we come to the practical part of this lesson. As for now, we can briefly mention one last aspect of directionality, which is the height of our sun. You should remember from our last lesson that this height will influence the relationship between colors of highlights and shadows. It won't have that much of an impact on the way we see the architecture in our case. We can see here that it's hard to see anything apart from slight changes in light temperature. The truth is that the perception of this area is very similar. You need to look broader at the entire scene to understand the scope of influence. Even when we operate between midday and late afternoon, just like in this example, we can notice a big difference. The intensity of the sky in the background is different. The balance between cool shadows and warm highlights changes. It will also strongly influence the composition because the shadows will be longer and the brightness values will differ as well. This will definitely be another tool to build the readability of an image. Let's check a couple of examples here. We have the work of our star guests here. Lots of cool stuff, These ones present the front lighting, of course. These are very different scenes made by different artists having different styles, but we can notice some common characteristics. For instance, darker, deeper skies, more natural-looking greenery, and materials that don't have these very distinctive reflections are the result of one extrema, the side frontal lighting. Contrary to them, we can check some backlight images out. You can clearly see all this translucency popping up, not only in the greenery but even in the examples like this one, in which those cabins' fabric cover appears to be almost see-through. Basically, sky colors make the impression of being brighter. We can notice here that this material is very dependent on its reflective aspect. We start to spot some micro contrast appearing, like the light playing upon this or that greenery or flooring here.
Alright, let's finally jump to our 3D scene. Let's get these things rolling, right? We will utilize everything we have just learned and we will try to realize it step by step. We'll put this scenario together from the beginning to the end, the same way it would look during normal production. So what are we going to do exactly today? Obviously, as seen in the mountains, some piece of modern architecture, but we still don't know how we want it to eventually look. We need to make our minds on the go, but since we don't want to trust ourselves and we also want to learn something new, we are going to look for some inspiration and references. Well, the entire process of looking for references is a crucial part of our job. We can open Behance, ArtStation, CG Architect, whatever works for you. We can look for anything that resonates with us, and the closer it is to our goals, the better. When you find something pleasing, always try to see the bigger picture first. Don't jump into analyzing details right away, but think about the overall qualities you enjoy. Contrast, tonal range, colors. You can always go deeper, but we often omit this first impression. We encourage you to be open and compare. This will be the process of building your personal benchmark in the long run. Certainly, apart from CG archives, you can and should also explore other areas. I mostly mean photography here, and there is also plenty of free stock websites to use. Unsplash, Pexel, Pixabay, just to name a few. We can find some nice quality there and use it pretty freely. Let's try it out. I will type in mountain forest. Let's see if we can get inspired by some images before we jump into this scenario. There's a lot of it, so don't hesitate and do your research before starting a project. Find something that you aim for. It may make you stretch a bit, maybe change your style slightly, and you will learn a lot in the process. It's going to be hard to find the perfect inspiration, but it's good to find anything to relate our work to. I mean, to have anything else to rely on than our own eyes. We can mention PureRef here, which is a pretty integral part of our work. You can just drag each of these online references directly into your PureRef canvas. There is no need to save it manually somewhere on your disk, and you can just put your board together quicker, just like so. But we have a different image this time. We have prepared an image from Pixabay that we want to use as a reference in this lesson, but since we don't want to waste time scrolling through the web page now, we'll just upload it from our local folder. We can leave it here in the background and jump into the scene. In the beginning, we can set our viewport layout so as to fit our needs. We have 3 windows here at the moment, but we also often work in a standard quad layout, and we pretty much recommend it. We can always click here and press T to set top view, F for front view, and of course you can choose the right side, left side, or whatever is more convenient here in your situation. We have one camera view and the additional one. In the bottom view, we have Save Frame option turned on. I will turn Save Frames off to use the entire space here and press U for an orthogonal view. Pressing F3 will give us default shading and we end up with a pretty useful 3D view of our scene. This is generally a fine layout. Top and side view to be able to work precisely in all 3 dimensions, 3D orthogonal view to get a better grasp on the scene, and the camera view to constantly check what we will get in our final frame. It is always useful to lock our view to render at the camera, so as not to start rendering accidentally for another viewport. Sometimes it can even crash the scene if we are unlucky, so it's worth taking care of at the very beginning. Okay, it's time to set our lighting system. We use Corona Sun and Sky again, so we insert the sun, click and drag to set the direction, and another click to confirm the height. At the moment it's totally random, we just want to put in our scene. We click Add Corona Sky Environment and everything is ready to go. Let's jump into interactive rendering right away just to see how it looks. We want to make sure that we have low poly layers turned on before doing so, so as to have this preview smooth and stable. The rendering probably doesn't look that great. Again, it's the same situation as the last time, and we will solve the problems one by one. You can see now, being richer in knowledge from the last lesson, that our tonal range is far from perfect. As for tone mapping, we will execute this lesson with a default ACES operator. Last time it was filmic, just to remind you, so it's a good chance to try something new, especially now after we learned a bit about tone mapping. We only need to lower exposure, maybe down to minus 1.5. Generally, ACES has a tendency to bring our shadows pretty low. It's not the same with all of the scenes, and often it's perfect out of the box, but it may be a bit problematic in this scenario. I usually compensate for it with a tone curve when it happens. Tone curve is very easy to set and based on numerical values, so it's also easy to copy from scene to scene. Using a simple curve can also be great, but it's a bit more arbitrary, sensitive and harder to repeat. The one important thing is to put the tone curve above ACES in our layer stack. We can then add some values in the lower parts and it will bring our shadows up a bit. If we put tone curve below ACES operator, it would be more difficult to select and distinguish between those shadows and darks because they would be already crushed down there. We would be affecting midtones rather than shadows in this case. Anyway, it's better to have tone curve above so as to get bigger control. Let's stick to these values at the moment and we can come back to them later if the need arises. So let's say that our brightness levels are more or less correct. Maybe apart from the sky, which is plainly overexposed, but we'll come back to it when we change Corona Sky settings. At this point, you can basically start to compare your tonal range with pure ref image, especially in commercial work, but we'll come back to this after we establish a depth in our scene. Nevertheless, it's always good to keep your reference at hand so as to get used to it. Preferably on the second desktop if you have one. We have only one screen for this recording, so unfortunately we won't have enough space to keep it on all the time. Anyway, these values seem okay, so let's move on. We can see now how our scene looks in pretty extreme lighting conditions. We can freely move the sun around and just see how our scene changes. This alone should give you a lot of information about what to expect, how it behaves, and whether the shaders are set correctly. And by the way, we will show you what does it mean to have a proper greenery shaders in just 2 lessons from now. Pretty interesting stuff if you ask me. This should be sort of a playground for you, and the time you spend at this stage will be beneficial later on. So let's have some fun. You can see how the height of the sun influences the perception of the scene, its colors, and the brightness of the light. You will get used to the way Corona Sun and Sky works pretty quickly. You can always expect some happy accidents, and one of the Corona Sun and Sky advantages is how versatile it is, and that you can test right away everything you can think of. Various scenarios, colors, directions, all of it right out of the box without getting into any advanced settings. Alright, maybe it's time to finally decide on some light direction. I think we would like to light the wall on the right side of the building. It was the left one in the last practical lesson, so let's pick another one now. I set it up so as to have that slightly visible micro contrast on the shaded facade, so the sunlight hits it pretty much at the grazing angle. The right wall is entirely in the sun. Let's not forget that we work with our imagination and try to ignore whatever happens in the background and in the foreground, especially this tree. We only consider the appearance of the architecture at this point and try to make this material pop, this corner to be well readable. We want to achieve warm highlights and cooler shadows on it. I must say that it is relatively easy to set up this project in the daylight, but sometimes it might be more tricky in your work, especially when you have other buildings around that cast shadows and can effectively block some sun directions. Nevertheless, it has never happened to me that this daylight scenario would be impossible to execute, so it's all about skill and experience when it comes to more difficult cases. Okay, I think this option is pretty neat. We have some brighter accents, some well-defined details in the shaded part, and the facade appears to be pretty nice. Okay, this part is checked. We are very aware at this point that we choose this front side lighting direction. You can already expect it to be more naturalistic, the greenery to be toned down, and the reflections less profound. You can anticipate it from the very beginning, and it shouldn't surprise you later on. We also started to define the depth of the image. I bet you remember from the last lesson that we first focused on our subject, our midground. We did the same thing here, but this time consciously and independently. We chose the side lighting and placed it within the available spectrum, deciding that it's to be moved a bit more to the front. Obviously, this is not the only right choice here, and we will explore various options in other lessons with different lighting scenarios. Not everything at once. So, as for now, let's keep in mind how the rest of our scene is expected to behave. More naturalistic greenery, deeper, darker sky, more of a matte feeling from the materials. Although the image isn't great as a whole yet, the midground came together nicely and it's already pretty well established. We can move on and focus on the background. We will add aerial perspective now to tone down this part of the image to make it less relevant. Let's open Material Editor and Render Setup, and we've got our Corona sky here, and let's just turn volume effect on. You may also remember from the theoretical part of this lesson that the volume effect tends to appear weaker in this kind of more frontal lighting. The readability of separate layers isn't that great. No worries though, we can always consider making it more apparent and adding even more depth to the image. We made it in the first lesson and we can repeat it here. Maybe not 2, but 1.5 seems to be okay. The other thing is that the sky is still way too bright, so just like the last time, we can set a higher altitude value and bring it down a bit. Higher altitude also influences the look of the aerial perspective. Its color changes, so there is still some space to adjust it now. I might come back to 2 in the end. Alright, we'll talk much more about the colors of the greenery and the sky in the next lesson, so let's focus on what we already know. Let's try to build a proper depth and tonal range. We added aerial perspective and it made the entire image look a bit too bright. I will adjust the exposure a little bit and just try to eyeball it. Again, we end up in the foreground and we need to cut off a lot of the light that gets into it from all directions. And just like the last time, we will try to solve this issue with a simple box. So let's create a box here, behind the camera. And let's add a basic corona material. I will just rotate it to be more related to the camera direction. And perhaps lower it down so the foreground is not covered in shadows that match. And we can already see some changes. But we encounter a problem of a different nature. Suddenly, it is pretty obvious that we have this box here. There's no shadow now with the new sun's direction, and this sharp, straight line becomes pretty obvious. We cannot hide it that easily. But as we said, the box is just the most trivial option, the simplest solution, and we can build on it. We have a bunch of other objects at hand, and a tree is always a good addition if we want to soften the edges. Let's take this one. It's a Corona proxy, which I will copy and set it to display as a point cloud. This way, we'll be able to at least estimate its shape. And you can instantly see, after I brought it forth, that something starts to happen. I will try to maybe dangle it a bit here, along this edge. I will see how the foreground behaves and what feedback it gives to me. We can see the shadow, and I would really like it to be cast on this tree, but without covering the entire lawn at the same time. Doesn't want to work like this, but we can always slightly rotate it so as to have more of it at the top and less at the bottom. Obviously, this shadow casting tree also has pretty irregular foliage, so it takes some testing and moving around. We can have a protruding part of the shadow from the individual branch and then a bigger clearing just next to it. Our goal is, as I mentioned, to cover the tree on the left side, at least its main trunk, and leave the lawn relatively sunlit. Alright, there is always an additional opportunity to turn our orthographic camera so as to align it more or less with our sun's direction, it will be much easier for us to understand what's actually happening between this object and the foreground. It's not a perfect alignment, but we can already see some results. We have a tree in the shadow and a lot of light on the lawn. This amount of detail tweaking is very typical. It might seem a bit clumsy, but spending some time on it is usually worth it. Okay, I think it is fine now. And of course, the box behind the camera works as well, even if this influence isn't that obvious now. If we remove it, we can clearly see that it cuts the direct lighting in the closest foreground and blocks a bunch of indirect lighting from the sky. You can notice it easily in the more reflective objects like stones or bark material. Therefore, it's pretty important to leave it there, although it might falsely appear that the tree is doing the entire job here. Okay, so we are in a pretty good spot, and now we need to make sure that our values are fine. We can come back to our pure ref, set it to grayscale, always on top, and mode to overlay selection. So we have our reference image docked here. And now we want to see also our scene in black and white, so as to be able to compare them. So as we mentioned in the previous lesson, we don't want to do it by bringing saturation to -1, because it's a slightly different operation giving different results. We need to do it by applying black and white LUT that is included in our training. So we have our image properly turned into black and white. As we can see, we landed our values pretty well. I would say that the sky is pretty similar. As for the mountains in the background, maybe we can make the ones in our scene a little bit brighter. Okay, so we boost the aerial perspective by increasing corona volume effect value. Maybe 2.5. Yeah, I think it's going to be fine. Close enough. As for the shadows and details in them, I also assume we are relatively close. Of course, the tree in the reference is way darker, but it plays a different, smaller role in the composition, so I don't think it is something we should adjust to. The whites scream a bit too much here at this concrete and these rocks, but again, it's not something we could change by simply adjusting our exposure or tone mapping. We would need to get back into materials to make them darker, or just take a mental note and come back to them later in Photoshop. That comparison went fine, I think. We can turn off that always on top option to get rid of pure ref for now. We can also turn off black and white LUT, and all seems on track. We are pretty ready to render this one. Let's just set up all the render elements that we expect to need in post-production. It's the first time we are doing this, and there is a lot to choose from. You don't need to feel overwhelmed though, because we will just select a handful. We'll discuss other ones in the next lesson, but as for now, as I mentioned, we want some masks which let us apply adjustments in Photoshop selectively to chosen elements of the scene. Each mask allows us to assign grayscale or primary colors to selected objects. We usually use this RGB mode with which we can render these selections as pure red, green or blue. This of course overlaps with 3 different channels in Photoshop and makes it super easy to select the content. So we will definitely use it, and this is now just a matter of what we want to put inside. We come back to our mental note about problematic elements, right? We remember that we wanted to have additional control over that concrete and those rocks because they were just too bright. On the other hand, it will just be universally useful to have an output for important architectural elements like the stone wall or the glass. The ability to modify them is always handy. As you can see, 2 objects were added and they will be rendered as 100% red in this mask. Similarly, we can click glass objects on the ground floor and above, add to the green channel, simple as that. The concrete plinth, it may go to the blue channel. This way I have all 3 channels filled with objects. If we need more of this, we can simply create another render element and we can continue our assigning. For instance, I want to add all those stones to this one. There are a lot of them in the scene, so instead of clicking them one by one, I will try to select them by their name. Most of them are in the form of Corona proxy, so I can just type in CRP rock. And here they are. I add everything that was selected. There are still a few leftovers which weren't exported to proxy. They have different names, starting with rock something, but there's just a handful of them, so I can easily select them manually. All done. Oh, and one more that is left here. We can add them to the red channel, and here we are, 70 objects added in total. What else could be needed? I think that would be definitely this tree in the foreground. We'll be able to darken it if it's still too bright after rendering. I would select it straight in this camera view. And of course there will be also a bunch of background objects, so I will jump to the top view to quickly deselect them. And there are some corona scatters on this tree, so we need to take them into consideration. If we want to add them to our mask layer, we need to add source objects that are scattered. We have them down here, twigs and moss. That's our 5th selection in total, and I think that's enough. One side note here to sum it up. If you want to selectively mask some greenery in the scene, make sure that you have these high poly production layers turned on, because all the vegetation will differ a bit. Okay, what's more here, if we are talking about masking, I usually save also wire color and ID. They might be not the most convenient ones to mask, because usually we have pretty random color there. Wire color is assigned randomly when we create an object and stays the same when we copy it. ID masking is even more all over the place, because by default it marks all objects in the scene with random colors. Nevertheless, it often turns out that we forgot to mask something on purpose and we have to help ourselves with these substitutes. I think that it's always good to have them at hand, and this is something I always turn on when rendering. And it's basically all that we need here. Everything is set. Render elements are set, we can start our production rendering. Alright, the render is finished, and I also dragged here all the masks we set. We can see one layer with red, green and blue areas, the elements of the building. The second one, the tree and the rocks. You can see that all the scattered objects we chose are colored, so this moss green seems to be all over the foreground. It's not a big problem though, we can easily cut this part off and select only the tree alone. We also have these two additional masks, wire color and ID. You can easily notice there is a crazy amount of random colors here, but it can be really useful if there is something unexpected that needs adjusting. Okay, we can start building this image while utilizing all those masks. Let's maybe start with this first one. We can affect the perception of architecture here, so let's begin by raising the brightness of that stone facade. Some other parts of the scene, the rocks, the plinth, are brighter at the moment and would like them to interchange. And because we have that RGB mask, we can get into the channels tab and see how the layer is split into three: red channel, green channel and blue channel. Each one is built of grayscale information that determines the pixels with the specific color present. We can easily select that white area. We just need to have left control pressed down and click on the channel. The selection will be ready. If we create an adjustment layer now, the one with a curve for instance, we will get it with a black and white mask already applied according to the selection. We can tweak that curve now to adjust the brightness of that element. This is what we talked about in the previous lesson, the tonal range and where specific values end up in the histogram. The curve adjustment is one of the most basic and versatile tools to modify it. You should really get used to it because we will use curves all the time during this training. It's really a fundamental tool. By clicking anywhere at that curve, we create a point, which then we can move around freely and modify the entire curve accordingly. You can see that the curve modification is super sensitive, so we must tweak it rather with tiny incrementations. However, there is an option that will help us a lot with it. We can press that hand icon here, and then when we click again on any area in the image and hold it, we can already see that there is a new point on the curve corresponding with the value we've just clicked on. Now, keeping our mouse button pressed, we can move it up and down and control that curve modification pretty smoothly. I chose the point within this facade tonal range and moved it up. We can do the same for this shaded area. This way we don't need to perform an arbitrary operation on the global curve, but rather modify exactly what you want to be changed. Okay, so we made our facade brighter. We can do the opposite with the concrete plinth and move it down a bit. It is slightly too light at the moment and there is no need for it to be. We can make it darker. So again, we get into the corresponding channel, left control pressed, and we click on the blue one. Let's create the curve layer. The mask is already applied. And here again we can select the hand icon, choose the area to modify and bring it down. Certainly it affects the curve organically, so we have also lowered this part here. If we don't want to, we can click on it and compensate by bringing it back up a bit. As you can see, it's all darker now, close to the facade range. I think we could lower it even a bit further manually. Okay, it should be fine now. As for the brightness adjustment, I suppose we still could take care of these rocks. They are masked on the second layer. We press left control, click the red channel and create the curve layer. And once again, we lower this range. This finally allows the facade to pop in the composition without any arbitrary elements being much brighter than it. Maybe just a few small ones left, like this deck and this wall. However, we haven't thought about masking them and they are not present in any of our two prepared layers. Fortunately, we still have wire color or ID to come to the aid. And here you can see this wall is distinctly green, so we can use it. I will pre-select this area and choose Select, Color Range. I can pick the color of the wall and adjust the tolerance, which can affect the anti-aliased borders. I usually try to land in the middle, but you can follow this black and white preview of the selection. Let's go. We've got the selection, new adjustment layer, and again we can modify the area of this wall. As for displays, we can see that wire color contains more objects in a single color area than ID layer. I will pre-select this area so as not to pick up those steps later. I don't need them to be touched. Now it's all the same again. Color range, selection, new adjustment, and making it darker. Great. The only thing that is left is the tree in the foreground. Green channel, selection, adjustment layer. I think we should lower it a bit, especially here in the brighter parts of the trunk, where the bark is visible. Obviously, we are darkening also all the moss in the foreground at the same time, but let's correct it with a simple gradient applied to the mask. I use black to transparent gradient here. I think that black to transparent or white to transparent gradients are super useful and I use them all the time to have additional control over masks. So we can smoothly make this adjustment on the moss disappear and only the tree is darker now. So we took care of all the values in the all selections that we wanted. There are a bunch of curve adjustments already here. At the moment, the hierarchy looks pretty alright, with the building being clearly the most tonally distinct element, and everything that used to be too bright and popped out is now gently toned down. So if we perform this entire value correction, we could jump to some color control. We'll just touch the surface in this lesson because there's a lot to learn here, and we will dive deeper into it in the next lessons. So we can assume there are a bunch of tools to control colors in our image, but let's just take one into consideration. Pretty basic one, which is selective color adjustment. Using it, we can choose the color range from the ones listed here and simply modify it with those sliders. The trick is to be able to properly connect what we see in the composition with the color range in this layer. Let's have a look at cyan. They will influence mostly the brighter part of the sky. We could say that this sky is dark enough, but saturation might be bigger. Maybe slightly less purple magenta because it should make it more commercially viable. I can't tell it by experience, but you will learn later on how to train your eye and establish that internal benchmark. Maybe we can add some blacks to lower the luminance and make it slightly darker. Some parts of the sky, the darker ones, won't be modified via cyans, but rather blues. You can see we can influence them now. Basically, we move all these three color sliders around so as to control hue and saturation. Their behavior might sometimes feel counterintuitive, especially when you are beginning your journey with colors, but you should try it nonetheless because it will help you to understand subtle color dependencies in the long run. Okay, we can see that the sky's appearance has changed pretty drastically. Maybe I will create a second selective color layer so as not to mix it all in one and focus my action on the greenery. It is a bit desaturated, and that's expected because it is sort of the result of the light direction we chose, right? Frontal light renders vegetation drier, more naturalistic and toned down. Remember this. We don't have this wow effect of vivid translucency, and we accept it. However, we can still try to boost a bit this overall saturation of greens. And we would like to intuitively choose greens to affect the greenery, right? Because come on, it is in the name. But it turns out that nothing really happens here. Maybe something in the shadows, but that's not something we would expect by moving all those sliders to 100%. It is like this because we might perceive it as green, but most of this vegetation is within the range of yellow. It happens very often in various images, so it's worth remembering. And now we have all that control that we wanted. I will darken it a bit, add some additional yellow to warm it up. Thanks to it, we will increase the perceived colorfulness of the scene. The appearance of blues and greens seems to be more profound now, and I think it helps here. And due to the fact that the sun is pretty high in the sky, it is automatically rendered as pretty desaturated. This makes the highlights of the building a bit cool, and we can, apart from modifying color ranges, use selective color also to fill tonal ranges with some tints. You can see whites, neutrals, blacks here. I will just take care of whites in this example and will add literally a few % of yellow and magenta. The highlights will be slightly warmer, but this is a very gentle touch. You don't want to overuse it though, it can easily become extremely tinted. That's it for the colors. We can only add a vignette yet. I will also use a curve adjustment layer here and just lower the areas close to the edge, especially the bright ones. We can separately select the darker ones and lift them up a bit so as not to lose the details here. This curve is pretty funky, but that's just an organic result of our work. I will now apply full black color to the mask and use white to transparent gradient to introduce just some darkening on the edges. We can always come back to the curve and adjust it if we need. For instance, now I'd like to slightly tweak it in order to make this sky appear more saturated in the darker part. We don't need a lot of it because of the composition itself, sky gradient, shadows, they all somewhat already build this vignette naturally. So here we are at the finish line. We made our first scenario from scratch and fully intentionally. We inserted the sun consciously, chose its direction, and set the proper values and depth with the help of references. We also did Photoshop post-production for the very first time. Honestly, this is exactly what you do in every project you encounter. We hope you enjoyed this one, and that's all for now, and in the next lesson, we'll dive into the world of HDRIs. More foreground tricks and post-production are also coming, so see you there!